Good morning, Chairman. We are now live.
Everyone. Happy New Year for the ones of us who haven't met since the turn of 2023. I do hope you're all well. It's a lovely morning. We will proceed if that's acceptable to everyone. So starting at item 1, can I have apologies for absence? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Councillor King.
Thank you. Item 2, declaration of members' interests. No, so we can declare at any time during the process. No, we'll continue then. And we have then the minutes of our previous committee held on the 14th of November 2022. Could I have those proposed and seconded as an acceptable record of the meeting? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Thank you. And now we moved on to the combined assurance report, which was our annual chance to listen to our chief executive and senior directors to give us an overview of the work of the council and the assurances that we wish to have and some horizon scanning as well. So with that in mind, I think I will perhaps pass over to Debbie Barnes, our chief executive. Thank you, Debbie.
Lovely, thank you very much. It tends to come round much quicker these days. It's a year already. Thank you very much for the opportunity for the corporate leadership team to come and share our experiences over the last 12 months with the committee. I think we really enjoyed this report in terms of being able to look back and reflect in terms of what some of our key achievements are, but also look through a prism of sort of reality around the pressures that we continue to face. The last 12 months we have without doubt continued to face significant challenges in terms of the delivery of services to the public, to our businesses and to our visitors as well. And the particular challenges that we, along like many others, have faced is certainly in terms of labour shortages, particularly in specific areas. And again, some of that will come out as we go through the report, but certainly workforce and challenges in terms of employing staff, but also being able to commission services in relation to labour shortages continues to be a challenge. Clearly, some of the positive measures that we've put in place have had a really desired impact, but that is a particular area that continues to challenge us. Over the last 12 months, again, probably not unsurprisingly, we've seen increased demand for our services, particularly around children and adult services, but also in terms of some of our highway services as well. Probably not overly a surprise, particularly we've seen some sort of backlog and increased demand around some services post-COVID. Child and adolescent mental health services, I think, would be a key issue in terms of what we're seeing, but also in terms of support for children with special educational needs, and obviously some of the hospital pressures that clearly has a knock-on effect in adult services are well rehearsed in the media as well. And then also inflation clearly has impacted upon the council, as well as the sort of cost of living crisis that's clearly impacted upon our residents and our need to be able to continue to support them. And we've also seen over the last 12 months a rise in the need for us to establish a service for refugees and migrants coming into the county as well, and welcoming those into our communities. But despite this, really pleased to be able to report that we're able to give a substantial assurance around our governance, our risk and control framework, and confidence that we've got control measures in place to mitigate most of our risks. And obviously this year we've had an external independent audit of our risk management processes, which confirmed that we were working at level 4 and in some areas level 5. So in terms of some of our key achievements, you'll hear from the executive directors that Children and Young People Services continues to be strong and received external validation through the Inspectorate. Our adult care services continues to perform really well, with many of our performance indicators being in the top quartile. Finance, we're in a strong financial position when we look and compare against some of our other local authority colleagues, and certainly have made significant progress in terms of the delivery of our corporate plan aspirations, particularly focusing on some of the work that we've started doing around automation as well, which are highlighted in the report. Obviously, a lot of effort has been spent on getting ready for the re-procurement of our back office services, and clearly plans are well underway in terms of that, but I'm sure there'll be some questions, particularly around our preparedness for our transition to our new arrangements. So just really then, in summary, in terms of some of the other risks, the critical areas of risk that we continue to face, clearly inflation remains an area of risk, both from a revenue perspective and also from a capital perspective. But obviously we're pleased with the financial settlement that we got from government in relation to the revenue challenges. Our IT infrastructure, and certainly we are seeing a reduction in the number of unsupported IT systems that we have, which is positive, with two of the big systems putting on to new, more sustainable arrangements. And as we continue to transition to the cloud for our IT infrastructure, many of our risks will reduce, but it is clearly a significant project to move everything onto the cloud. Market supply, particularly within adult care, and Glenn will cover this in a bit more detail, continues to be a challenge for us, linked clearly to the workforce issues. But not just adult care sort of market supply challenges, also having some challenges in terms of our strategic contracts, particularly in relation to home to school transport and the accessibility of drivers, some of our placements for children in care and special educational needs, and clearly we're investing, establishing more of our own provision because we feel that it's better to step into some of those markets given the current challenges. So an optimistic picture. Clearly our elected members and our workforce continue to work incredibly hard to mitigate some of those risks, but clearly some ongoing challenges which we face as a council, which is like every other council are facing as well. So I'll pause at that point and happy to take any questions.
I hope we're not jumping the gun. Thank you very much, Debbie. I'd like to go back to inflation because it seems to me that it obviously is going to bear upon the current situation, particularly because we know what the inflation rate is, or at least we've got an idea of what the inflation rate is. I think it does vary depending on which part of the economy you look at. But I do wonder what comfort you can give us that you're looking into the future as well, because decisions in this coming financial year will obviously take into account the inflation level that we know about, but what's our expectation, or how are we taking into account the expectation about how inflation is going to go? I mean, hopefully, there's going to be good news in the fairly near future, but until we know that for sure, we may well be putting ourselves at risk in terms of making wrong assumptions. And particularly in projects, because projects obviously go over a number of financial years perhaps, and if we know that the current level of 10% or whatever it is only going to be for this year, and it's then going to be substantially less next year, the year after next, if we're talking about financial years, we would make decisions, I think, on what we are thinking about or what we know. But we must manage that risk in some sort of way. So how does the council go about managing the risk in terms of expectations of inflation over a number of financial years?
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Andrew to answer the question around inflation, and then I'll follow back up in terms of some of the risk management strategies.
Thanks, Chair. So clearly we've got a well-oiled medium-term financial planning process now, and particularly in terms of the inflation challenge, I think we can classify some of our major cost bases into probably about three buckets really. So we've got contract inflation. So clearly a lot of our services are outsourced or in forms of contracts with providers. We've got pay inflation, and then we've got I guess the emerging thing over the past year in particular is around energy. So in terms of contract inflation, the medium-term plan takes well account of what is profiled for inflationary figures at a particular point in time. So if we look at, for example, the Serco contract, it's based on a basket of inflation at a particular point in time, the previous autumn, and we can track how the inflation profile is is working out through sources like the Office of Budget Responsibility, for example. So pretty clear that based on what we know now, things like that are clear. The pay award situation has been quite challenging, because the pay award that was presented by the local government employers last summer was completely, it was a different concept to how it's been set previously. So it was a flat rate figure for all levels of staff, no matter what grade they were on. So we've made broad assumptions going forward over the next 2 years, at least, around a broad 4% pay increase, which we think is about right based on what the sector is telling us at the moment. Most recently, last couple of weeks, all the major pay bodies have put their claims in, and they are significantly different to what's in the budget. But there is a reason for that. They are asking for above around about inflationary pay rises, which would be massively unaffordable to the sector. So there's the final position will come down somewhere in the middle. Last point is on energy. For members who attend some of the scrutiny committees where we talked about energy before, would be familiar with the concept of us forward purchasing energy through the Eastern Shires Purchasing Organisation. And again, the budget plan makes assumptions around inflation tailing off on energy around about the 2025 period. So we've seen a significant uplift this year, 8, 9, 10 million pounds. So that's covering things like our, running our buildings, but also the street lighting estate that we have. But again, assumptions about it comes down over the next 2 years. And again, we're obviously naturally keeping a very keen eye on the wholesale energy market and how that then feeds through into consumer pricing. So am I confident on the revenue side that we've kept the current budget plans that we've got forward towards that will be going into council at the end of this month? I am, but again, things change, and that's the reason why we've maintained a corporate contingency budget of £6.5 million in the current set of budget proposals. The capital budgeting is challenging. A lot of the major projects we have in Andy's area have seen significant cost profile changes, but again, a lot of work has been undertaken internally, with challenge from colleagues around setting reasonable budgets based on what we know now. And again, there's contingencies in place in the capital budget to cover things like overruns. But again, it's something that we are taking very, very seriously, and something that we are monitoring, not quite daily, but it's taken a lot of focus in terms of those specific as a risk area for us. So.
Could I just come back on one point? From a revenue perspective, yes, I think you can do what you've been talking about. Capital projects or releasing capital projects, I think, is a bit more difficult, because they may operate over a number of financial years. So if you could just elaborate on that point. A further point in relation to those sorts of things is value for money calculations, because the economic justification for going ahead with projects or putting projects into the programme is obviously dependent on a number of things. Costs won't be fully reflected perhaps of the situation that we're entering into, and I just wonder whether the benefits are similarly affected in some sort of way, or even disbenefited in some sort of way, which makes the value for money calculations even more difficult. So what might have been looking to be a good project may no longer be one, and I just wonder whether the projects are reviewed in that sort of light, or whether we just plough ahead with them because they were all right at the time when we did it, which could have been a couple of years ago.
Okay, I'll try to come back on some of those. So I guess whilst from a term perspective, revenue is 1 year only. The way that we plan financially is we do look naturally 3-4 years post hence. In terms of ensuring and providing members assurance that we're a sustainable council financially. We can't just look at revenue as a 1 year thing. So in terms of the processes that go into that, I don't. Whilst the capital project will go on for a number of years, and will experience challenges, or the market within which we're operating changes, the actual way that we monitor and feed back how whether it's a capital issue or a revenue budget, we put the same matter of emphasis on it. So I'm hoping I'm answering that question. In terms of the value for money element, that is a really good question, and I think a lot of, if I focus on some of the major projects that we're involved with, which do take quite a few years, and particularly around the highways issues where we've received funding from the government in the form of DFT grants, benefits analysis, value for money is a really big key part of ensuring that we continue to keep on with those projects and that they meet the tolerances that the funding's been provided for. So again, I think we've got the processes in place to do that. Smaller projects naturally can happen in the space of a year sometimes, so you generally expect that they would meet the value for money conclusions that they did at the point it was taken. But we have put in, and I've got it in my section within resources, we have got a lot more internal process now around how we ratify capital business cases, how we support each other as a professional disciplines in terms of presenting as strong a case for capital projects as we can that are based on on the foundations of value for money principles and what have you.
Thank you, Chair. This was a good read, actually. I would have thought any prospective employee reading that, which would be wise for them to do so, these papers, would think that's a safe place to go and take my talents. So in addressing Debbie's point about staff recruitment, then this reads like a well-run council and a sustainably well-run council, which of course is a tribute to the councillors for making wise policy decisions and the officers for implementing them. A few detailed points. Andrew, flat rate pay awards, do they have problems with differentials or are they popular? I'll leave that with you. Secondly, on page 14 of the bundle, there's a risk there of adult care and community well-being, but only hospitals listed. Now, I would suggest that it's the lack of integration of hospitals, primary, community care, and all sorts of other things that is the risk, and that's the big challenge for the integrated care system, to bring those together. So it's not just hospitals, and indeed the solutions to hospital pressures are probably in primary and community. So suggest a rewording there. And then finally, and Glenn might comment upon this later, very pleasing to see, because we had this grilling of the financial control team, didn't we, about why our bad debts from adult social care were such a challenge. You're reporting they've gone down significantly. So I'd like to hear how Glenn or others managed to do that, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Just going back to Debbie's main points, and then we'll pass on to Glenn. I'm sure can answer Andrew's question in a little bit more detail. Have we got other sort of broad policy points for Debbie?
If I could just come back on the workforce issue as well. So you're absolutely right, it does read like a really well-run council, and certainly staff give us feedback that they enjoy working at LCC and think it's a really good place to work. Where we've had some particular challenges, I suppose, is the agency market. And so particularly if you're looking at social care, people who are trained and qualified as qualified social workers are seeing a career option move into an agency. Clearly the benefits in terms of pension, sick pay are not the same as working at the council, but they are paid significantly more in the agency sector. And, you know, if you're 24, 25, you're not necessarily thinking around your pension, you're much more interested in what your annual salary is. So I think some of those challenges are real that we've had to face in terms of losing staff to agency. Now we've done various different sort of strategies to try and mitigate some of that stem of the flow of people going to the agency workforce, but clearly working for the agency workforce is better money, and you can have much more flexibility around your hours as well. So that's a particular challenge that we've seen here.
I'll come back on that flexibility issue. The higher rate of pay becomes a self-fulfilling thing, doesn't it? You know, the more the demand is intense, then the agency can charge what it likes. And You try a shift manager in the NHS at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, they have to pay whatever the agency is asking for. But flexibility, could more be done on that? Because in my research into the NHS, which is on the 99 bus from Retford to Doncaster, because people speak on buses and they assume nobody's listening, flexibility is often a big factor, but maybe the extra £5 an hour is the bigger factor.
So you're right, we do work flexible policies. I suppose the reality is that some of the challenges is that we want social workers to be going out seeing children and having relationships with children, and that means going to visit whenever the family needs them. And so there's a limit to how flexible you can be, because we want to deliver good and strong, outstanding services to our residents. Just the hospital point, and I know that Glenn will come back on this when we go through his section. You're absolutely right. It's around how you integrate it together, because there is unintended consequences of one thing. I think the critical issue that we are seeing now, and completely agree that the strategic answer to the challenges is absolutely really strong, localised, community responsive services to be able to support people as close to their home as possible, so that they remain independent. Because of the sort of national focus around the hospitals, what we are seeing is that there is a belief, and we do not think it's a correct belief, that the problem in terms of patient flow and discharges from hospitals is because there is insufficient adult care response. That's wouldn't be a view that is shared across the council. The discharge and the patient flow arrangement is much more complicated than thinking that there is one particular solution. The big risk for us at the moment is if that myth, if you like, gets energised, and then people commission contracts to be able to address what they think is the problem, it destabilises the market. And so I think that's the critical issue that we're facing at the moment, but absolutely completely agree that the solution is to look at developing an integrated response and focus very much on community.
And if I may, Chair, could I commend you to the Times last Saturday, the Somerset model that alleges to have cracked it? Glenn's obviously read it. £12 an hour they're paying their care staff. Glenn, is that sustainable? I don't know, but if that works, worth considering.
Yeah, just come back briefly on that. Thank you, Chair. So yeah, a couple of reasons behind that and why that was brought in. Obviously, the inflation point when that pay award was raised, it was obviously still on an upward trajectory at that point. I think the increases in the national living wage since that was brought in over the last few years has created some erosion into the bottom of the national pay spine. So the flat rate of £1,925 per individual was designed to sort of create some resilience, I think, at the bottom end of that pay scale, and individuals on those low scales saw some quite significant percentage increases. So it's a very live debate around how that pay scale can be future-proofed, and still hasn't been resolved technically yet. So it'll rumble on.
Thank you, Andrew, for your response. Have you got any further board points, Debbie, and then we'll move on to Glenn, if that's acceptable.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on a few bits. Of course, with health, a real good health and welfare programme is also key to prevent people falling ill in the first place, and the more we can encourage people be engaged and being responsible, the less problems we have at the end. But I do agree about the comments of you can stoke the care homes and stuff to be something you don't want to be. In fact, some of them are already starting to change their profiles to where the profit is. So that's something really to watch. I'm going to go back to a bit more basic things about infrastructure and IT being delayed, because that will have a key effect on other parts of the transformation. And as I always know, with delays, there is always cost escalation. And I just would like some confidence around that part. Moving on to, we've talked about recruitment and staffing. I would also like some reassurance about apprenticeships, training people, which I know is going on, and all the good things that we do, and while picking up the flexibility of, because obviously since we've had our problems with COVID, people are actually expecting a more flexible work style. In actual fact, people are working for other counties further down south because they're getting paid more and they can do it virtually. So it's about how we make our offer more attractive than others. So that's a fair bit to get on with. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll let Andrew come in on the IT issues. In relation to apprenticeships and training and development, you're absolutely right, Councillor Skinner. We do lots of stuff around apprenticeships and have invested more in terms of apprenticeships. Obviously, it tends to be a bit more of a slow burn. You know, some of our apprenticeships are 3 years in the making before we can actually begin to see the impact, whereas some other apprenticeships are obviously fast-tracked over a year. So I think there is more that we can do in terms of apprenticeships, but certainly have increased and continue to increase the numbers and the range of apprenticeships that the council offer. But clearly, this is an area that we can and we should and we are committed to doing more. We don't utilise all of our apprenticeship levy at the moment and clearly want to be in a position where we do utilise all of our apprenticeship levy, albeit we do passport it to some of our commission services as well. So, you know, Lincolnshire benefits, but certainly in our people strategy, one of our work streams is absolutely to increase the amount of apprenticeships that we have and the range of apprenticeships. Flexibility, obviously the hybrid way of working, smarter working has helped us deliver much more flexibility towards our workforce, and you're right, we are seeing staff probably leaving us to be able to get much higher paid jobs elsewhere nationally and been able to work from home, particularly around the sort of commercial aspect, those commercial skills. We've seen a lot of that, and some posts you know, are able to be delivered much more flexibly. Although clearly we do think that it is good for people to come in with their teams and work with their teams a couple of days a week as well. So there is a bit of a mix, isn't there, in terms of being able to have flexibility to work from home, but also then being able to come in and reconnect with your team is good for you and for the workplace and for innovation and creativity. But equally, there are some services that you can't deliver that flexibility for. You know, fire and rescue, social care. You know, you can't do some of those posts virtually. You need to be able to be on a rota and be in, and that's just the nature of the beast as well, isn't it? So we do try as much as possible, and certainly smarter working has helped much more flexibility in the workplace as well.
And I'll just come in on the IT question, Chair, if that's okay. So yeah, so the specific element in Debbie's introductions around our progress against removing what's known as our technical debt. So we've had a historic reliance, as many other authorities have, and organisations on, you know, servers, you know, software running on servers and what have you, and have adopted over the last three to 4 years this cloud first strategy. So every project we stand up, we see whether we can provide it via the cloud to reduce expensive storage costs, as well as those risks that present themselves around you know, having, you know, running functionality on old servers. So we've, over the last year or so, we've seen a massive improvement in the numbers that we've got running on old servers, albeit still not completely eradicated, but it's part of what we'll be looking at over the next year. And I'll go into a bit more detail in my section around a lot of the improvement work that we'll be doing in IT over the next year. So it's around, you know, managing strategy projects and prioritisation. So if I can come back to it in a bit more, Councillor Skinner, when I get to that point, and it might give rise to further questions.
Thank you for that, Andrew. I mean, obviously, we're not limited to slippage with capital programmes, typically finding 30% on cost because of building costs. Where are we with position with regard to those? Is that a problem to us?
So this is specifically about capital infrastructure now, then, is it? Sorry, yeah. So, sorry, yeah, okay. Yeah. So, well, we have seen quite a sizable change in the capital programme cost base. Michelle might be able to help me out with some of the figures, but obviously we've seen some of the major projects that we have around Grantham Southern Relief Road, for example, Spalding, and forward planning for the North Highcombe Relief Road, for example. We have had to amend those based on building costs. The flip side of that is we haven't we're not proposing in this current budget setting to add anything other significantly. And I guess that goes back a bit to Councillor Allen's question as well, as about how do we manage that uncertainty. We're not adding anything major new into the programme until I guess the current uncertainty around costs settles down a bit, because it is difficult to stand up things when that aren't already in train.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for your response. So with that in mind, and thank you to everyone for all your comments, just one question from me to Debbie, and I know we'll pick this up through Andrew and Michelle later on. Are we happy about our outstanding debt situation overall, Debbie?
So and again, I think we'll cover this when we come on to Glenn's area in particular. I think in relation to the debt, clearly the area of most concern is clearly the adult care debt, and a huge amount of work has gone into that to reduce the amount of debt moving forward. And certainly Glenn will cover this in a bit more detail, but certainly we have changed all of our processes, working very closely in terms of with Serco, and obviously as part of the re-procurement we plan on bringing those back in-house. So again, a bit more of an integrated approach with the service and with Exchequer services, and certainly feel that downward trajectory will continue, and feel much more confident in terms of our upfront processes around the management of debt as well.
Thank you, Debbie.
Chair.
Stephen, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in the customer services centre comments which are meant about calls have been reduced. Can we just, it was highways which sort of struck me first when it sort of says there that we've had a reduction in calls of 30%, but can we make sure, can you assure us that the actual amount of information coming in, the complaints from the public or the comments from the public, are in fact increased by the system, or are they actually just hold still? Because I think what we do get is a lot of that there. A number of people out there will not use digital systems, not necessarily use email, and they come to me and say, oh, can we phone? And we're encouraging them to phone because otherwise they won't be there. But I'd just be interested there, what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. So just really to provide assurance that we haven't turned off anything in terms of the phone capacity at all. The areas that we have seen a bit more of a shift, I think I outlined in the report, but if I give you one example, is around registrars and being able to make appointments in terms of weddings and registering deaths and requests for death certificates and birth certificates, etc., etc. And certainly have seen a considerable shift to people wanting to access it, but absolutely can give you confirmation that we haven't turned any of it off so that people are still able to call and be able to ask questions and speak to an advisor as well. I don't have any information off the top of my head around correlation with regard to complaints. I don't know if Andy does, but certainly we haven't reduced capacity in any way to stop us taking calls.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think my point was, have we, perhaps the word complaints wasn't quite what I meant, but the endless comments we get about potholes and so on, I'd just be interested to know whether there has been any effect on the amount of information coming into the council and what that effect might be by moving towards the digital platforms away from the more traditional phone systems.
Yeah. I'll hand over to Andy, because certainly I think that the information that managers and the highways officers now have at their disposal is considerably greater than what it was previously. But I'll hand over to Andy.
Yeah, I think the quick and perhaps flippant answer is that we are getting more and more information, and we are fully aware of where the defects on our highway network actually sit. As elected members, you've obviously also got access to the information that comes through to you individually, to each of you in respect of your ward areas, which gives you a snapshot position. and you're also encouraged to have direct relationships back in with our local highway managers to make sure that we're getting that local information, that local data. As I perhaps imply in my part of the report, is the demand still outstrips our capacity to actually repair, unfortunately.
Yeah, Debbie, if I may pick up on your comment about Serco staff being rehomed. Cause I'm intrigued by that because, as you know, the police have rehoused their back office functions, and reports to their audit committee where I sit is nothing went badly, it went smoothly, etc. Nobody left, everybody's happy, etc. Now that might be a false dawn. Is that part of a general strategy for good policy or strategic reasons, or is it just an ad hoc decision in respect of the adult social care finances?
So obviously the Serco contract comes to its end in 2024, and we cannot extend it. We would have to go through another procurement. And so we've gone through an analysis of all the various different services, very much from a sort of organisational, agnostic sort of type perspective. If it's better for us to continue to deliver outsource, then we should, and if it's better for reasons to be able to insource it, then it should. So it's about which type of services are best suited given the current market at the moment, and considering a whole raft of other things. So, for example, with regard to the delivery of the contact centre, the customer service centre, we're out for a procurement on that, with no intention to bring that back in-house, but to go out to the market. Whereas some of the other type of services, including the exchequer services and adult care, the decision is that we should therefore bring in-house. And again, I think it is, with regard to those particular services, is the sort of join up really with regard to the service, and the fact that a more integrated approach would make more sense. So it's very much horses for courses as opposed to a single strategy.
Well, you're real googly now. Would that extend to buying back some care homes?
I'll turn to Glenn, wherever he is.
Chair, would you like me to answer that? So the provision of residential care, if it were run by the council, would probably take about 2 years before the council had no money to pay for residential care. It's about 20% in excess of what we're already paying. The government's intentions around fair cost of care would have closed that differential, but the government took the view that that was unaffordable, the consequence of which is that that particular white paper, the social care reform white paper, has been pushed back to after 2025. Sorry, Chair, I think that was a no.
Probably Glenn would agree with me here, Andrew, what the council has tried to do, particularly over the last couple of years, where circumstances are quite difficult for particularly the independent care home sector. We've tried as much as we can to support them administratively, to keep them there to provide the services in the future, I think.
Thank you, Chair. There is one other observation I might make. It hasn't yet happened, but I believe it will, which is that members will be aware that £1 billion of the NHSE budget has been allocated to commission 5,000 extra acute care beds. We've got one of the lowest provisions in Europe of acute care per population, and add ambulances to the system. In Lincolnshire, we've got some 80 active recovery beds commissioned from the private sector, commissioned by the NHS. And the ULHT board has on record a plan to reduce acute capacity by 80 beds. The likelihood is, I think, that we will start to see the NHS start to buy private, particularly nursing or high dependency in the private sector, which is less expensive and easier to use because the capacity is there in terms of staffing, than adding ward space to a hospital that frankly can't already sustain its staffing capacity.
response, Glenn. And thank you to Debbie for your answering all our searching questions and giving us some assurances there too. So perhaps now we could actually move on to Glenn in terms of his combined assurance report to us, and then perhaps we can delve into those questions a little more deeply.
Thank you, Chair. By way of an opener, if I may, I'll turn to a couple of points that have already been raised, one of which was workforce. Have to say, if you asked me this question 2 months ago, I'd be more concerned than I am today. The situation both within the council in my area and also in the external market has, shall we say, stabilised and slightly improved in terms of employment and capacity. The government this week intends to announce an international recruitment fund to further support recruitment, not just in my area, but also in the NHS, but in particular my area. And the money will be used to support regions, so 9 regions in the country, to target international recruitment into social care. There are 3 audiences. I've got a lead for that in the East Midlands. And for the East Midlands, the target is 3 audiences. Ukrainian nationals who are here, typically of working age, typically with lots of skills, and have a right to remain for 3 years. Perfect. In Lincolnshire, we've got 1,000 plus Ukrainian nationals, all of whom want to, as it were, have opportunities to either go into education, find a job, and will also develop relationships, of course. The second audience are internationals who are already here. The university has a lot of foreign internationals doing courses and at weekends want to do work. So just one example of that, which is a group of Ugandan nationals doing an IT master's at the university who are working for a home care provider at weekends, 20 hours a week. They're earning some money. It's working perfectly well, which comes back to one of the councillor's members' earlier points about flexibility in employment. In quite a few of my areas, full-time roles are completely unhelpful. You need flexibility, and you need flexibility in order to target certain audiences who otherwise wouldn't work for you. So that's another target audience, internationals who are already here, who might want to do some part-time work, but are not yet in the social care system. And then the third group are people overseas who might want to come here, but, shall we say, are struggling to do so. And one of the reasons for that most recently was that the Home Office have got a backlog of international applications for social care in this country of 60,000 applicants, which would make a bit of a difference at a national level. So you'll appreciate that relationships between government departments is as important as it is between what we might do locally here, not just with the university, but with other employment sectors. So that's one thing that'll get a bit of profile, I hope, later this week. The second one was the debt question. Yes, debt is coming down, but there will be a limit to how far we can go with that. My expectation is that the run rate in a council of this size would be 7 to 9 million. I ran debt management in Hampshire, which was a much larger authority. That was between 9 and 12. So we're about 7 to 9. And of course, in my area, debt incorporates quite a number of different areas of debt, not just debt from individuals who are paying for their care. It's about 25 million in total. And we've recently had, as Lucy hopefully will nod, an audit review of debt management, and that came out as substantial. So I'm hoping that will also provide some level of reassurance from an independent perspective. The ICB, Integrated Care Board, previously the CCG, owes us substantial sums of money that goes onto that debt list, particularly around the Better Care Fund, but also we've got quite a number of pooled budgets. So that is a big chunk of debt. Typically, we see that as secured debt. We've got a number of other areas of debt. So people die and their houses then go onto the market for sale. We secure a debt against property, which is perfectly normal practice. That can account for some 4.7 million of the 25. And then you go to legal processes, whether your estate's in intestate or not, that can account for some 4 million. And then something that's coming up and becoming a bit of a concern, members will be aware of backlogs related to the post-COVID world. One of those backlogs that hasn't had much national profile is the Office of the Public Guardian, OPG. The OPG operates things like court of protection processes, and that relates to an increasingly significant level of debt that we have because the OPG has got a backlog in dealing with court of protection cases. So in our world, that's something like £3 million dependent upon the OPG clearing their backlog, it is a him, his backlog, of substantial numbers of court of protection cases. That's actually a risk to us because until they're resolved in court of protection, then the debt isn't secured. So that's a growing level of debt. Before COVID, it was about 500,000. Today, it's 3 and rising. So as one thing gets managed, another one bubbles to the surface. But we'll keep on with it. And it's always terribly helpful when you've got to report to the leader of the council every 6 months on how you're managing debt, in making sure that you put some energy behind it. So that will continue as we're reporting back to the leader in informal exec later this year in May. If I can turn to other points, Chair. So a couple of observations. If I was to worry a lot, particularly this year, it would be in 2 areas. One is pay inflation. You'll be painfully aware of the nurses' claim. The unions that represent my area and local government are also coming forward with pay claims for 23 that could prove to be influential in budget management terms. There are other groups, other professions who are also, I suspect, waiting on what happens in the nurses' award. That may set a precedent that could prove quite challenging, not just in terms of strike action, but in terms of what that then does to the baseline of pay. The second area is fee rates, what we pay to social care providers. And I'm particularly worried, and I have mentioned this both in this committee and also in scrutiny and to the leader, which is that the social care market in Lincolnshire is typically small to medium enterprises. That's really helpful to us as a structural configuration because we have very good relationships with those small to medium enterprises in Lincolnshire. They're Lincolnshire based, we know them, and they tend to have a lot of loyalty to area. There is a clear and growing trend away from SMEs to bigger providers who are not based in Lincolnshire, whose approach to, shall we say, fee levels is much more robust, and they don't tend to take into account the other things that we do, for example, negotiate 3-year agreements, which when I first came here was what we went to straight away, and we've had 9 good years of fee negotiations, which also means that in between times we're spending more effort on improving services and looking at opportunities to invest in other areas of activity that might benefit the market but also cost less to the council. That is beginning to dwindle because we're increasingly having 1-year agreements. So officers are spending a lot more negotiating something that then gets agreed that in a few months' time they have to come back to. That's not a good place to be in, but it's very much our world at the moment. And I sense that fee inflation will be a driving force for the coming year or two. and these are big budget areas. Residential is well over 120 mil. And so that's a worry for me. Some of the things that, because I'm a glass half full person by nature, I'm particularly excited by the fact that we have a number of investment propositions, particularly around digital and particularly around housing. It doesn't often get much profile in the council, but I've got a 12 million capital budget. The reason it doesn't get much profile is there's no borrowing requirement. The consequence of that is it means that with partnerships, we're able to secure much improved accommodation for people in Lincolnshire. The housing stock in Lincolnshire is not good. It's not very good in this country, actually, but it's particularly not good in Lincolnshire, particularly for the population that we have when you look at our demographics. A substantial number of older people growing, and substantial numbers of working age adults with disabilities, some of whom come through Heather's area on an annual basis. They all need specialist housing, which we lack. So that investment's really important. And in terms of capital costs and inflation, what you tend to find is that, particularly in my area, the business case says that between 16 and 22 years, what we invest in a capital build, so DeWitt Court 70 units, the payback's 22 years on the council's investment. So we've got an agreement for 30, so 8 years of profit, if you like. Most of our schemes have not changed in terms of the business case for investment, and that's because revenue costs have gone up just as much as supplies of building material. So there's a netting off between extra capital costs, but also revenue costs going up as well. So that hasn't really had much of a material impact, but it does have an effect on the cost of build, but not the business case. And there's quite a material difference there. And then if I may, Chair, just to finish off, the NHS. I'm fully integrated with the NHS because I married a GP. I have a lot of sympathy for our NHS colleagues, but I have to say that particularly the media and political perspectives on Debbie's phrase about well-rehearsed narrative in the media, which is that it's all adult social care's fault, is rot. We're about 25% of all discharges from ULHT, 25%. That leaves an awful lot of room to play with the 75%. But the other thing is that I think the challenge for us, and it was a point well made by committee members, integration with the NHS in Lincolnshire is in a really good space for working age adults, for community equipment, for child and adolescent mental health services. It's in a really bad space for older people, which is where the NHS's biggest pinch point comes, particularly end-of-life care, which if you ask the ULHT Chief Exec, Andrew Morgan, would say that there's an awful lot of end-of-life care in the hospital, which is where it shouldn't be. So there's an awful lot to play for. Primary care in this country is in a parlous state. If you think hospitals is a bus model, the primary care system is not far behind that. And whilst we have a level of coming together within the NHS family, in my area, there is a sore need for further integration, particularly around the older people services. Our NHS colleagues in the community and our GPs. If we can do that, Mr. Middleton's point about there are more solutions to acute pressure in the community than there are in the hospital is well made. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Glenn. As always, it's intriguing to hear how things actually are on the ground rather than what we hear in the news, which always isn't as informative and doesn't provide us with the facts. Andrew, thank you.
I think tour de force is not inappropriate there. Your grip and understanding of the massively complex field is highly impressive, Glenn. But given that you identify and you are very close to the NHS in Lincolnshire, nobody could be closer, not just because of who you chose to marry. if you recognise that the adult integrated provision is not in a good place, can you give us encouragement that it might get there, or what does it need to jolt them into getting there?
Thank you, Chair. So glass half full again. 3 things that we're pushing hard on this year. I have to say we've tried some of them in the past and failed. And that's often because NHS structures were changing and there was more attention to those changes being required than stepping outside the box and doing something different. The first one is around occupational therapy services. So Lincolnshire County Council employs about 70 OTs. We're the biggest employer of OT capacity in the county. And then you've got the Acute Trust, who employs OTs. And then you've got LCHS, which employs OTs. And then you've got the primary care networks, who also employ OTs. Well, OTs are in a bit of a short supply, so there's a real danger of fishing in each other's ponds, which does happen. So we, for about a year now, have been pushing hard on an integrated OT service. So why does Mrs. Brown, coming out of hospital, potentially see 3 different OTs employed by different parts of the NHS and social care system in Lincolnshire? That's a mess, and it's also expensive. And it also generates workforce pressures that otherwise would not be there. So if some of this workforce pressure stuff isn't because we can't get the staff, it's just because structurally we're not helping ourselves cope. So that's one debate. And we're pushing hard on that. It's been a bit bumpy, to be honest, because different rates of pay apply to different organisations employing the same people, arguably doing the same thing. The second one is intermediate care. So this is about re-abling older people to get home, be independent, stay connected and build up their resilience, whether that's before they go to hospital or after. Front door and back door. You've got to manage both. We are close to having a business case that would bring all the different elements of intermediate care in Lincolnshire together in one place. And Debbie's expecting me to report on that in May this year. It's going to be substantial, and it brings together 3 NHS organisations. Why did we fail to do that in the past? Well, to be blunt, there were 4 CCGs in Lincolnshire before there became 1 and now 1 ICB. The 4 CCGs did not actually know how much they were spending on intermediate care and didn't necessarily agree the need for a pooled budget. In Lincolnshire, I can say how much we spent on intermediate care. I could have said that 9 years ago. So we think that the NHS configuration at the moment is probably in the best place it's been for a long time to do that kind of thing. 1 provider, hopefully 1 commission, 1 pooled budget. That should be the ideal model. And then the third one, members might have heard me mention neighbourhood teams in the past. Okay, that's another failure. I'm not doing very well on this. 11 years ago we began this journey. I'm still working on it. And the challenge is that to get all the GPs, as much as I love them, into the same space on this is a nightmare. You've got over 50-odd practices in Lincolnshire. You've now got 15 PCNs. But there weren't 15 PCNs 2 years ago. But now that there are 15 PCNs, primary care networks, employing GPs to do stuff, that's an opportunity. And I think, again, being the optimist and keeping at it, trying to get there, we've got a chance this year of, again, trying to bring together LCHS, the PCNs, and ourselves. To be fair, it's a lot easier for me to do that than it is for them. In terms of models, members mentioned the Somerset model before. Well, there's a Somerset model, the Leeds model, and there's the Northumberland model, which is all of which are, it's that classic phrase, isn't it? The truth's out there, it's just not evenly distributed. That there's bits of evidence for what might work better. There's a Lincolnshire model as well. We've got some really good examples of what works. But when you try to put them all together, it's a nightmare. Classic case, we've got a number of community hospitals in Lincolnshire. The Northumberland model has acute care episodes of 3 days and no more. It's surgery, and then you're out. That's not what happens in Lincolnshire. It's not what happens in most systems. And that's because the community hospitals are basically move-on accommodation with support on an integrated footing in Northumberland, which of course looks a bit like Lincolnshire if you think about distributed populations. Heather's, again, an expert in that. I'll defer to her on that one. So there's the Northumberland model potentially has great relevance for us here in Lincolnshire. The challenge is that the community hospitals sit with LCHS, not with ULHT. And if LCHS gave up the community hospitals to ULHT, it would no longer be viable because it's only a small trust. I'm just giving you a hint of where some of the challenges might lie, Chair.
Thank you, Glenn. Councillor Skinner, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. A very good demonstration of how good a cat herder you are, Glenn, there, going on. Reading down the list, public health must come under you, I guess. And attacking the thing from the other end, and one of the things that a lot of people don't realise how much deprivation the East Coast has, district public health profiles, how useful they are for tackling this. Would you like to say and outline some of the work you've done on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. That's a really interesting question, very timely. Derek has just produced his DPH report, which looks at communities where there are some natural, as it were, overlaps that could be described as, well, you're urban or you're rural coastal. And I suppose that's me saying as diplomatically as I can that administrative boundaries don't always make good sense in terms of where communities are. And in Lincolnshire, you've got basically 4 communities, one of which talks to rural coastal, which in Lincolnshire there's a lot of, and the East Coast is a major area for further improvement in all public services, not just my area. You've got a wonderful public health service in Lincolnshire, really cracking. You've probably got one of the best in the country, I would say. And that's not just the DPH, Derek. You've also got stunningly good infection control team that became, as it were, took on its own role very much during the COVID period and is now being picked up by North and North East Lincolnshire as best in class. You've got some also a business model for public health in Lincolnshire, which is quite different. I think I might have mentioned this previously, Chair. Please stop me if I did. Which is that Derek has got a public health grant, 30-odd million. But he also spends another, say, 10 million of what would otherwise have been social care funds. Why? Because Derek and his colleagues do prevention really well. So housing, carers, IT, the wellbeing service, which is in really good form and has also helped with the Ukrainian settlement programme, all of which sits under Derek and his team. That's a very unusual business model nationally. So Derek's remit is much broader here. One, because they're really good. You know, if you've got something great, you build on it. So Derek takes on a lot more. One of the interesting things, though, I also got public protection at the beginning of last year. And the linkages between serious violence, domestic abuse, child protection, and what Derek can do, we're beginning to explore because there are some wonderful opportunities there, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And the housing factor and the quality of housing you mentioned earlier, all poignant with that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew.
Glenn's right to say there are pockets of expertise all around the country that if you only could lace them all together into one holistic package, that'd be wonderful. But dangle 2 points in front of you, Glenn. I'm involved with the Barnsley Healthcare Federation, which is a GP federation of all 32 practices, 1 PCN, and interestingly, the place director for Barnsley ICS is the Director of Adult Social Services.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Northumberland does the same, but that's because they've moved the delay somewhere else in the system.
Let's leave that one hanging there. Yes. Thank you so much, Glenn. I think that's very enlightening as always. If we're happy members, could we move on to children's? Heather, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about some reflections for children's services and also some future scanning for where we're going to be focusing going forward. So, as the report highlights, Lincolnshire's children's services continue to be strong. They're heavily regulated, so you get a lot of external assurance from the inspectorate. This year we've had visits from Ofsted, from CQC and from HMIP into our various different services, the being our youth offending, our social care and our children's public health nursing service, as well as children's services and child protection. So lots of external assurances provided to us in terms of how we're performing and how we are comparing nationally and regionally to our counterparts. We've recovered well from the pandemic. All our services are back to full delivery, but there are some significant challenges which I've highlighted in the report. I don't intend to dwell for a long time on the workforce issues, although that is one of the things that I'm most worried about at the moment, but I think we've spent a lot of time talking about that currently. But it is a real challenge for us, and in children's services, the agency dynamic that Debbie talked about is particularly difficult. There's been some pretty aggressive marketing of agencies for children's social workers. We are faring better than other children's services with that, but you will have seen last week the announcement of the government's response to the Josh McAllister Care Review, and that is seeking to tackle that. That is out for consultation, and should it be implemented as it's currently described, would go a long way to addressing some of those challenges. But that hasn't stopped us from doing things locally to mitigate the risk. So we have put in place additional apprenticeships. We've put in place additional payments for our frontline child protection social workers, and we're working really hard to ensure that Lincolnshire continues to be a great place to deliver social work, because it's really important, as was said earlier, that Lincolnshire is a safe place to work and is a strong place to work, but it's important that we remain competitive. We know when we talk to our workforce, they tell us the training they receive and the supervision they receive are the biggest factors in why they want to continue to work in Lincolnshire. So we want to continue to do that. The other areas of challenge I wanted to highlight was the placements. It's really difficult in the market at the moment. Market providers can choose which children they take from a range of different local authorities, and they are becoming risk averse. So where we have children with complex needs and multiple different requirements, it's easier for providers to say, no, we can't meet their need because they've got another 5 or 6 children waiting to take that placement. And that leaves us in a very difficult position because we have children who desperately need the right placement, and we can be struggling to get that at times. So we're working really close with the government around that. Again, their response to the care review will go some way to tackling that, but it is going to continue to be an ongoing pressure. And as we said earlier, the problem is that once demand outstrips capacity, cost rises and matches that. So the cost of placements is also difficult. Again, what we've done locally is we've stepped into that market. We delivered 2 additional children's homes this year, and we're working really hard to develop the foster caring market further. It's fair to say, again, we perform really well in comparison to our peers. We have more foster carers, we keep them longer, and we have more of our own internal children's homes provisions, but that will continue to be a challenge for us. We've got a really ambitious transformation programme in place at the minute that's looking at how we develop our residential estate, our foster carers, and also the way in which we place children, so that we can be more engaged with that market and try to manage that market a little bit more. The difficulty is in comparison to adults, where Glenn's the commissioner for the majority of local placements, that's not true of children's services. So children's services are competing with each other cross-boundary, and a children's home can open without consultation with us, and another local authority could fill those places. So we don't have the same relationship with the market as we do in our adult services. Public health nursing is another area where we're struggling with workforce recruitment. There's a national shortage of health visitors at the moment, and Lincolnshire's not immune to that. Again, we're faring slightly better, and we definitely fared better during the pandemic because we didn't see the redeployment of our public health nurses into other health services because they're employed directly by the local authority. And the other challenge we've got is around our educational outcomes. So we know that at the end of GCSEs, at the end of secondary school, Lincolnshire's pupils compare reasonably with their peers. They're in line, and that's not true at the end of primary school, so we need to do some work to drive up that performance at the end of primary school, so that flows through to above average performance at the end of secondary school. That's within a context where local government's involvement in school improvement is being removed. So we're no longer funded in the same way for that school improvement. So it's about influencing that system rather than directing it as we used to. The other area I've highlighted in the report is the occupational therapy. There's strong links to what Glenn outlined about the lack of integration across provision in occupational therapy. That's also true in children's services, and there's quite complex arrangements around equipment and provision. But we do know where we saw a bit of a lull during the pandemic because parents with children with significant difficulties didn't want the risk of people coming into their home during the pandemic. That has stored up a backlog that we're continuing to work through, and we're having to prioritise that and triage those cases so that we make sure we're seeing those most in need as quickly as we can. In terms of next steps, I think Lincolnshire is a really significant player in children's services. We are a bit of a market leader. We're a partner in practice, a sector-led improvement partner with the department. So we're currently supporting North East Lincolnshire with their improvement journey in children's services. And I think we really need to use that position to work for a national plan for children. We know that we've got increased inequalities, which Glenn's talked about, and that the cost of living crisis is hitting children particularly hard as their families struggle. So we want a really long-term plan that looks at early intervention to address those inequalities. I mentioned the care review and the government's response to that. This is a really important time for us. We need to shape that response. We'll be doing a response to the consultation with the government, but we want to shape that. And there are different elements of the government's response that suggest they're going to be looking for trailblazers. We've already been approached about some of that work. We need to think about where we want to position ourselves on that and how much we want to get involved in trialling new and innovative approaches. And that's somewhere where we've always been in Lincolnshire. I think we need to do a lot of work on the inclusive education system. So nationally, exclusions of children from school are rising, and we've got some challenges around that in Lincolnshire after a long time of performing really, really well. We're still comparing well, but we are seeing those rises. So we need to think about what we do locally as well as working nationally around what the drivers to those exclusions are. Because we need those inclusive spaces that say children with additional needs will be supported within mainstream schools where they can, as close to universal services as possible. We need to continue over the next year to address those workforce challenges. We're going to need to be innovative and really think about what it is we can do differently that will help us to address those challenges. And again, there's going to be some Pathfinder programs with the department, and we'll be interested in supporting with them. I think we're going to have to continue to have a broader discussion about children's mental health and well-being. You'll have seen all of the reports nationally. Again, in Lincolnshire, our ICB has invested in this area. We've had additional funding in to address that, which is incredibly positive. But we need to continue to think about what the impact of that pandemic and children having significant periods of their childhood in isolation is as we move forward. And I think the other element links to the integration with the ICB. So Children's Services is a little different. Our main partners are schools and police and health. And so we can't have an integration that's just with health. It needs to be more sophisticated, and we need to position ourselves in a different place for that integration. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is, as the ICB really struggles with that discharge of older adults, there is a lack of focus on children and young people. And Glenn and I are working with our ICB colleagues to ensure that Children's Services remain at the forefront of their thinking, to ensure that we're not piling up problems for later on as they transition into adulthood. So that's something that we're really committed to doing in Lincolnshire. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Heather. That was very, very informative and great to listen to all the complexities of issues you're facing at the moment. Mark and then Andrew, please, if that's okay.
You've had far more questions than I have.
See, just fair share.
I'd like to say what the Chair has just said. Yes, it's been a very informative report, and an area where the overall assurance levels, seem to be certainly going in the right direction, and not a great deal of worries. I would just like to make a couple of comments, one of which is to do with mental health. I think that is an area, and you have indicated that you've identified that as one that needs looking at, and I think that is entirely correct. I do think there's going to be a significant issue coming out of COVID and lockdown, and all the issues associated with the education of our children that took place during lockdown, all the issues associated with lack of education. So I think that is something that we need to be aware of, because it's not quite a time one, but it's a growing area of concern that will make demands on us. You mentioned placements as well for perhaps the more difficult children who are going through early education. And as a counsellor of about 2 years, I've had 4 of those cases in Sleaford, all of which are to do with the difficulty of getting possibly quite difficult children into education, because in all cases they were placed in local schools who said they could manage and would do X, Y, and Z to actually do with that. But within a matter of days, and presumably when they found out how difficult the children were, they were effectively sent back to their parents because they were unmanageable within the normal school situation, or within the school situation that they said they had. And that puts parents in a very difficult position, because what do they do then? And in in 2 of the cases out of the 4, the parents, the children were sent effectively out of county to find somewhere which had a greater ability to cope with these children. And again, not enough from the sound of it, because the parents were called back in the day to take the children away from those particular locations as well. So they end up then with education at home. And because of the fact that the people are coming into the home to do the education, and because there seems to be a variation in terms of the people that are sent, it's not just one person that's sent all the time, it does seem to change quite significantly, and sometimes doesn't take place. There's a message sent through, I can't come today for whatever reason. Or I've been slapped by another pupil, and I've had to go sick. It does seem that these children end up with about 4 or 5 or 6 hours education a week, and that goes on through effectively all their child education lifespan. And I do worry then that what happens, once those children then go into either what should be secondary education or into adult education, because they don't seem to be able to be prepared for that situation. Although in lots of cases, and this is what the difficulty was that one parent suffered, the child was very limited in terms of reading and writing, never mind any other parts of the education, but was very, very good on computers, very good in terms of accessing the internet and getting information that he needed to get, probably in a video type form, but would not be assessed particularly well from a normal reading and writing sort of point of view. And that seemed to have some impact then in terms of what the education plan might be for the future for him. So it's just it's not really a question, it's an observation in terms of what I've experienced, which matches some of the comments that you made.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So if I start with the mental health comments, so we are undertaking a review of mental health services in Lincolnshire currently to ensure that they're fit for purpose as we move into the future. Lincolnshire's unusual in that the council is the lead commissioner of the mental health services, so that's been agreed with the ICB, and that allows us to really focus on it, because obviously for children's services that's our core business, and so it means it does get really good attention, it's monitored closely, and we work really well with the provider. However, the provider does have the same workforce challenges that we're having. We have significant challenges around psychologist employment in Lincolnshire and also across the region. And it does mean that some of those really specialist tier 4 beds where a child might need inpatient provision cannot be opened, not because the bed isn't there, but because the staff are not there to staff it. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's a theme across everything we're saying today for the public sector, is recruitment and retention of qualified staff is a real challenge. But we are continuing to work with that provider, and we are confident through this review that we will be able to meet the demand that we've got coming through. And we're also confident with the way in which the provider is triaging those. I think, again, really important that that relationship's a really close one. We're in it with the provider, so it's LPFT. We work with them, and we also have always commissioned early intervention services for many years now. So Healthy Minds Lincolnshire's been around for a long time, which is about de-escalating needs so that they don't require those specialist services. The government's then responded and now funds a Healthy Minds in School service. There are some restrictions on that service which are frustrating to us because we think the service is great, but the way it's set up is very urban-centric. It's about a certain number of pupils within a certain geography, which we just don't have because our schools are much further apart in terms of our market towns. So we're working nationally to ensure that that can be as flexible as possible. In terms of those placements, you know, really disappointing to hear that experience of the children in your area. Unfortunately, I think that SEND system nationally is a really, really challenging one. We don't have enough placements, and we have too many children moving from mainstream into specialist provision nationally. So that links back to that inclusive education system about mainstream schools having the resources and the support to be able to keep children in mainstream education. We know children who stay in mainstream education are much more likely to come out with 5 GCSEs, much more likely to go on to a meaningful post-16 pathway, but there are challenges for schools in retaining them there. I won't go, I mean, I can go into the specifics around elective home education versus home tutoring, and they are very different, and our statutory duties and responsibilities within them are very different. So without knowing those cases individually, it's hard for me to tell which ones were elective home education and which ones were home tuition. So that's something I'm happy to discuss elsewhere. The other thing I would say in terms of the exclusions for the committee to be aware of, when a child is excluded from school, the school puts the education in place for the first 5 days, and then the council is statutorily required to provide it from the 6th day, whether we have a place or not. That would be the instances in which we're having to put home tuition in place whilst we source a placement, but it should never be long term. That's not what we would want. The pressures in the SEND system mean at times it's longer term than we would want. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Andrew.
Thank you. I think you're supping from the same well as Glenn in terms of your positivism, so that is encouraging. I was going to ask about mental health, but you've given a very assuring answer that you're well ahead of the curve there, even though you can't magic people out of the air. Couple of thoughts in respect to Councillor Allen's challenged children. When I was running a college, we would occasionally get approaches from the county council saying, we've got a really challenging one here. Is pre-16, but if you can only tap the vocational interest in X, you might salvage them. And I did a couple, not easy, but don't rule out approaching college principals with a checkbook. You'll need to pay, but there's a double benefit in terms of you would have to pay anyway, and you might get a change of attitude and behaviour in the young person. And the second point is, can the university not help you out with training health visitors?
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So completely agree, for some children, vocational training is a pathway back to engagement, and we've seen that evidenced multiple times. We have got several vocational pathways that children can go on. The registration is complex, so in order now for colleges to take pre-16-year-olds, they have to have a separate registration, and there has to be, there's issues around, for example, the bathrooms that mean there's some requirements, but we do work with our colleges and we do meet with them and talk to them about what we need, and so we have got those pathways there. And I agree that one of the things that we were talking about just this morning is, how do we make sure we've got coverage across the county? How do we make sure we continue to prioritise that? So it's definitely something that we would want to look at. In terms of the training of health visitors, so there is a training programme, and we engage really early on that training programme with them. So we take all of the health visitors on a placement, and we have the health visitors on placement with us. And then what we've done this year is we have guaranteed that they can get jobs in the teams in which they're doing their placements, in which they're developing relationships. So we do have those connections, and we'll continue to do it. I think nationally, recruitment to the health visiting courses is a challenge. There has been some change in how the health visitors are recruited. So there used to be a maximum amount of time they had to have practice in children's nursing before they could go into health visiting. That has changed, and so now they can go straight from doing their children's nursing training into being a health visitor, and we welcome that change because it is a different role, and it isn't about having experience on the wards. It's actually the training you're going to get of doing that care in the community and doing that work in the community. So we've welcomed that change, and we've engaged with the university around that.
Heather, Paul and then Stephen, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to briefly touch on positive futures. The work that they do is quite fantastic, and then occasionally, as an engineer part-time these days, I get involved with STEM, and really positive. So there you go, positive things to do.
Thank you. Just a comment about the educational attainment. I appreciate that over the county, we might well be at post-16 hitting the national targets, but I suspect, in fact no, within that there will be some areas which, I wouldn't want to use the word sink, but perhaps don't meet quite those standards. Are we working on those to get that up? Because obviously that does make a difference. And my other question is, many of the secondary, and I appreciate primary as well, are in fact academies. Does that create a problem for us in trying to support the young people of Lincolnshire in improving the standards?
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the district variation, absolutely, we're really aware of that, and the Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee ask for a breakdown by district whenever we take our standards reporting, and are very keen to understand, so what's the difference in response where you have a difference in performance at the standards. I'll go back to highlighting the big difference that we're moving into now is that the County Council is no longer considered to be a key player in school improvement, so it is influence. We don't have a huge team of school improvement consultants who are out working with school leaders. It's about how we work with school leaders to connect them to each other and to the offer that is funded through the government and through the teaching schools. And we have a really good relationship with the Teaching School Hub, and we make sure that as they are running the programmes, we work with them to identify schools and academies that we feel would benefit. The policy, the unwritten policy in Lincolnshire has always been Lincolnshire's children are Lincolnshire's children regardless of what kind of structure they sit in. So in terms of the academies, we work well with the academies. Some of our most inclusive high-performing schools are in academies. Some of them are maintained schools, and we continue to work with those school leaders to deliver it. Where it can cause problems is there's slight differences in terms of what we are able to do statutorily with academies. But on the whole, the role we play in school improvement now is one of coordination, influence, connectivity, and you can do that without needing statutory duties to do that. Where we have concerns about the performance of a maintained school, our powers of intervention are very different. Where we have concerns about an academy school performance, we first and foremost talk to the academy school, and then we'll use other levers that we've got, such as the regional directors at the DFE or Ofsted if necessary, but we always make sure we've tried to resolve that locally and have a conversation with them. And we're very aware that some of our secondary academies are serving areas of Lincolnshire that present significant challenge in terms of deprivation and adult employment, and it is really challenging. And what we want is the very best teachers to work in the areas where we need the very best education. And so it's about how we stay close to those people who've chosen to step into a leadership role in those schools and how we work alongside them. So it's support as well as challenge.
And presumably, as some of the academies now belong to really big chains and work with schools outside the authority as well as in, and they tend to move the teachers around, are we able to put any influence on saying, look, we want the better teachers in perhaps the schools which need the most improvement, which might not necessarily be the best schools within that particular organisation?
Thank you, Chair. Effectively what I would say is if you're a CEO of a multi-academy trust, you want your best teachers in your most challenging schools. So their motivation is the same as us because they are judged on their results. So I would say on the whole, CEOs are absolutely about increasing the performance across all. They can't afford to have a school they don't worry about because then when Ofsted come in, that would be difficult. We don't have lots of big chains in Lincolnshire. In comparison to other areas, we've actually got a lot of homegrown chains. We've got one or two, but they don't have huge numbers of schools in Lincolnshire. So it's still very much a local system in Lincolnshire. And where those big chains come in, they also are prepared to come and work with us and share some of their expertise and learning from other areas. And what we want is for our CEOs of our multi-academy trust to be able to work together and learn from one another. And there is a little bit of a worry in terms of the government's white paper, which would set a bit of competition between the CEOs because it starts to limit growth of academies and it starts to put kind of conditions on the growth of academies. So we're working hard with the department and with the CEOs locally because we want them to work together. And we've got a really great group of CEOs working really hard. So we need to make sure we keep them connecting to each other so that we can get the best across the whole of Lincolnshire. Having said that, the white paper has been removed from its progress through Parliament, which will present some challenges as we go forward and something we'll need to look out for as the year progresses, because it did contain some elements we would have liked to have seen gone through.
Thank you both. It was actually, I was going to ask you, Heather, about the academisation programme, because it's been a bit of a moving piece, hasn't it, over the last year or two. But am I still right in saying that there's a drive to getting all the schools into some sort of academy status at some point, and that's going to make some quite challenging situations for some of the smaller primary schools, for instance, who I don't think any of us would like to see forced into a particular group that they weren't comfortable with.
Yeah, so the white paper did say it wanted all schools to be an academy by 2030, and that's been removed from its progression through. But the department has been really clear that the intention is still to move towards full academisation. There are lots of benefits to working together in groups of schools, and there's lots of benefits around the pooling of resources and the development of central teams where it works well. But we also have some very highly performing standalone academies and maintained schools who don't want to be in that position. The policy position in Lincolnshire is that it is for school leaders and their trustees or governors to make those decisions, and the council doesn't tell them that they need to move into a trust or get involved in those decisions in that way. But we do help them to think about what might be the good fit for the trust if they were considering going into a trust, and how to engage with the stakeholders of their school in order to do that. So I do anticipate we'll see further growth in the academy sector in across the country, but I think it will be more considered as we move forward. So I think what the government's really clear on is we need the current academy system to be able to thrive as well. So we need a system that is inclusive. We need trusts to have a certain number of schools, so they've got that kind of buy-in power so that they can deliver improvement in the right way. And therefore, it won't be about school leaders coming together without fitting the remit of what the regional directors are looking for in each area.
Thank you again, Heather. Thank you. If I could perhaps move on to resources. No? Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so I've got the tough act of following my two positive glass half full colleagues now, so we'll see how we get on. So my section covers the Resources Director, and if I can, Chair, as well, could I also cover the corporate section at the end as well, given I'm covering that for Debbie as well, so I'll segue into that one at the right point. So first and foremost, the first point to raise is obviously the makeup of the Resources Directorate changed since we last came to you this time last year. So from April, I took on James Drury's responsibilities for the old commercial directorate as well. So a new wider focus resources function covering pretty much all of the corporate back office functions for the council now. I'm going to go through each one in turn to bring out a few of the major flavours in each area, and I'll start with IT, which has been one of the most challenging ones for over the past 12 months since taking that on last April. You'll see from the text that we are seeking to move from a more technical focused type approach in that area to one that's more focused on business outcomes, and there's a big journey to go on with the rest of the council in terms of delivering that strategy. The biggest decision we've made in the first sort of 12-month period is around taking the decision to delay or pause the re-procurement of the current Serco services that are outsourced, that were originally due to be broken up and re-procured in April 2024. The decision's been taken to pause that for 2 years, taking or making use of facilities in the contract to continue with Serco for a further 2 years. There's two main reasons for that, really. One, we talk about the acute recruitment challenges across the council. IT is no different in that space. But one of the things that we found as we worked through the discovery phase with Serco in terms of how we were going to reconfigure the different services was around the actual gaps that we'd have in terms of the services that we were proposing to bring back in-house. That, coupled with some issues that we've been discovering around the maturity of the function, particularly around its contract management arrangements, for example, were enough to be able to pause that procurement and seek to have some leadership changes and to go on an improvement programme, which we'll be undertaking over the next 12 months. I'm pleased to say that's in train now, and developments will come forward. I think there's also a big role for IT to play in the rest of the organisation. So I refer in the text about maximising the benefits of the Office 365 estate, linking that to the point I make in the legal and governance section around digital records management as well. So a lot to do about how we use the facilities that we have and make best effect of them. But over the next 12 months, we'll hope to see a more council-wide strategy that delivers business outcomes, and one that's direct links to the budget and what have you as well. So really keen to see that work through. I also referenced the EMPSN arrangements in there, and I know we have touched upon it on a previous committee in here following the network outage we had back in September. But again, that's another area of focus for us, as that's an ageing organisation, company, and need to see and assess the benefits of looking at whether there's other different ways of providing that provision. So I've put that on there as a horizon scanning item, so to speak. The big challenge area that I've picked up as part of the transfer of the old commercial areas is around corporate property. We're really keen to develop council-wide strategy related to our property, give a big boost to what was an in-train corporate landlord process, but one that really needs a lot more work on in terms of understanding the full lifetime of the assets that we work in, and how we you know, work to that and work with council services to maximise their use of those built assets. Obviously, the other big area to finalise and to bring you know, bring fruit to this year is the actual, you know, building rationalisation around the smarter working programme. Again, we've brought that into this committee previously as well, so more to report on that. Looking ahead again, you know, not a risk at this stage, but something that's going to require a lot of cross-council involvement is around the re-procurement of the property contract in 2025 as well. So we're currently with Vinci Care in that space, and we're currently standing up a project to work through what would be the re-procurement of that as of April 2025. Moving on to transformation. Obviously, the transformation programme is a corporate-wide one, and I say Debbie's referred to that in her preamble. But I think the major one within the resources space, in terms of various elements of my teams that are driving that, is the go live of the ERP system in April. Work continues apace on that, so we've been through the various you know, key milestones now around the payroll parallel running, which I know members have been interested in previous committees, and we're now in the thick of you know, user training. Data quality still maintains a challenge to us. We're going through continued processes in terms of the data cleansing elements of that project, and you know, it's going to require a council-wide approach to ensure that we use that new system to the best possible effect, so we don't experience some of the challenges that we've experienced with the previous version of it. And again, keen to you know, keep updates on that. The commercial team, obviously, I think Glenn has left now, but we half the team in the commercial team support Glenn in terms of his commissioning activities. So it's a very fully involved and fully integrated part of his team in that respect. But we also lead on the central procurement and corporate procurement for the rest of the council. Plenty of activity in that space around the one commissioning council model in terms of ensuring that we've got best practice shared around the council, developing, you know, corporate-wide procurement registers, all of the best practice sort of things that you'd expect to see that continues apace. But that area is also leading on the re-procurement of the Serco contract that we touched upon briefly before as well. So prior to us pausing the IT lot of that, you know, that basket of services, there's also the insourcing of the exchequer and adult care finance functions, the continued outsourcing of the customer service centre that was referred to by Councillor Bunny earlier, and the HR admin and payroll functionality as well, which is currently proposed to be delivered by Hoople, who are also providing the ERP. There's a full programme in place for that, and I guess if we're talking about risk mitigation, there's a fully involved project governance around that to ensure that timelines and the processes are adhered to, so we experience as seamless transfer of those services as possible next April. Moving on to finance, the finance team will be heavily affected by that. ERP obviously goes live right in the middle of a year-end process. But again, fully involved in that process in terms of the implementation. We've talked previously about the financial management code, and we're currently in the process of that external health check on that work, so look forward to sharing the outcome of that with members shortly. But I think the general feeling from the first element of the process was a positive experience that the colleagues at Grant Thornton had when they were on site with us last week. Debbie referred to the positive external assessments around the internal audit and the risk management functions earlier. Very, very positive to see, and naturally, as you'd expect, we're really proud of our audit team, and hopefully you'll echo that, Chair, as you have done in previous meetings too. That said, the team have continued to experience recruitment challenges in the year, and we're naturally doing all we can to ensure that any gaps that we've got are filled, and obviously there's a senior leadership change in that space as Lucy leaves us as well at the end of March, and Claire gets up to speed too, so one to definitely keep an eye on. Moving forward into HR and organisational support, obviously, we hear about the recruitment challenges across the council. That requires resource to support, and the HR team have felt that fully, particularly over the last 12 years as they've supported recruitment campaigns, utilising the recruitment and retention policy to its max in terms of supporting services be as imaginative as they can, and they have experienced capacity challenges as well themselves in doing that. We're obviously also trying our best to broaden and strengthen the people strategy, so latest additions around equality and diversity, and making that as real and as useful as possible, coming back to the questions we had earlier about ensuring that we're an employer of choice, and that people do genuinely want to come and work for us in this council. We are a great council, and we need to keep on keeping on the front foot with that to ensure that we attract and retain the very best talent we can. I've referred to in the red risks area the apprenticeship levy. It's already come up as a question. The reason why it's red is it's essentially our ability to maximise the levy. We're currently at 91% maximisation of that. So essentially the risk, it's one of those classics where the risk has actually already happened. We're not maximising it fully, but we are at our highest ever point that we have been since it came in terms of the number of apprentices on roll. So never taking our eye off on the ball on that, but just wanted to explain why that was presented as such in there. And then last but not least, legal and governance. Again, we've talked previously around recruitment challenges in that area. It impacts most acutely on Heather's area, really, in terms of the ability to service the complexity of the cases. And we've been on a journey in terms of growing our own to the extent that we're only utilising one locum in that area now, whereas it was many more previously, albeit the complexity of the challenges in children's services, caseloads and what have you, that Heather referred to means is we are having to rely still on external support whilst we continue to sort of grow that capacity upwards and what have you, but one that we're again not taking our eye off the ball with. I'm really pleased to say that in the sphere of council companies, something that the committee will naturally be interested in, the legal services alternative business structure will be going live, or is going in the process of going live at the moment, so that gives us the ability to work with other council companies, something that we've been impeded by the Solicitors Regulation Authority previously, so really keen to see that progress. And then lastly on the legal and governance areas, really it's been a challenge for us for a long time now, and has become more acute as we've been moving out of buildings as part of the smarter working work, is our ability around records management, really important, but one that we're making progress on. I think at last count we'd catalogued and resolved 60,000 records, paper records, which is quite not an insignificant amount given the size of the council. If I could just move on to corporate as well, just to cover those key areas. It's a very small area of the council. It's essentially the Office of the Chief Executive, covering the policy department and the comms team, and we draw out two particular risks in that area that are just worth meriting. One is the media management side of things. Clearly you can be as proactive as you can, and the team are really good at being proactive, but there is an element of reactivity sometimes, and it's just reflecting that risk there. And the other one, again, the other risk is predominantly just around, again, a recruitment and resilience challenge, in the fact is that the internal comms team is just made up of one person. So I just wanted to reflect on those, Chair, in rounding up. Thank you.
Take some questions if that's okay. Gentlemen? Any further questions? I know you've asked Andrew one or two issues already around items that came up through Debbie's report. Are you happy with that? Could I ask you one thing, please, Andrew? You said on the documents management, now that is, I mean, historically the amount of physical paper we had to keep would be fairly eye-watering. How do we accommodate that with the Data Protection Act, where you should only keep things for the minimum time you would really need them, in view of the personal nature of some of these things we're keeping? And looking forward into using cloud software, you know, how will we view probably changing a software supplier, because once you've done that, the license you had before wouldn't allow you to go back and access those records. So just a couple of points.
Yeah, thank you. So retention is first and foremost in terms of the work that the team are doing on the hard paper records. So, and there's an element of prioritisation around newer looking records to make sure that when we catalogue them, that they are have proper retention periods, and it's this clarity. And where we are out of any retention period, there is a decision making point for the service to make about whether to destroy. There are different, the challenge that they have is they assess different elements of the, you know, underground storage or whatever it is we've got here, you know, whatever building it is we're looking at is the type of record, because there are different elements of retention that apply to different types of records, with, you know, in-care records and what have you. So that's the biggest challenge that the team have in working with services to get through that. In terms of the digital work, so the council's had its own in-house document management system, IMP, for a number of years, and that's reaching end of life now, not least around, you know, becoming an unsupported system, for example, but also in terms of how well it works with the other elements of the Office 365 estate. Office 365 makes provision for you know, good document management around, particularly around the SharePoint functionality, but also the OneDrive. And the big challenge we've got, again, it's another part of the IT improvement programme over the next year, is how can we firstly maximise the benefits of moving off IMP. It costs us a lot of money, in the region of £600,000 each year to run it, but also as well put in appropriate data management and electronic record management processes, utilising all the benefits of Office 365 around the retention functionality, to ensure that we don't, I guess, repeat the problems we had of the hard copy that we've had in the past. So that is a project in its own right, and again, happy to sort of refer to that at future meetings in terms of how the progress we're going with that.
It's a problem for all established businesses, and historically you would have had to keep a huge amount of paperwork, and probably always will have to keep some amount of it on paper. Thank you. Any further questions to Andrew? Andrew, did you want to come back on?
I have covered the corporate bits. It was just those last two bits at the end. So if there's anything else that anybody wanted on that side of things, happy to answer any questions on that as well. Sorry, Chair. I've referred to them very briefly. I was probably too quick in doing it. It was about the media, the reactive to the media issue, and the resilience of the internal communications team. But I'm happy to expand on it if anybody would like any further information. I haven't got anything more to add. I think it's just acknowledging that there's certain risks that we've got that will almost never be green, I guess, because of the nature of the nature of them. So I guess when you've got an element of reactivity to anything, it's you're at the mercy of what happens in the outside world. I think it's the only thing to add to it. So, okay.
And perhaps now we can move on to Andy. Issues regarding the place, Andy.
Morning, councillors. Thank you, Chair. The Place Directorate, the services predominantly under my control are probably those services that give you most rise to issues in your postbags as councillors. So I'm very aware in terms of Councillor Bunny's earlier question in relation to the level of demand on our services. It's an area which is quite difficult to keep people entirely satisfied. Everyone has an opinion on our roads, on our waste collection services, our libraries and such like. Against that backdrop, I think we're in a situation where you can see that our level of risk has come down from a high level of red risks in previous years to a much more manageable level. And the area of particular concern in respect of our high level of risk relates to something which is, I suppose, in summary, being done to us. So the way that the government are now allocating funding out to the public sector has changed. So some of this is driven by the changes and consequences of the Brexit situation and where funding arises from. But government have also determined that a range of different funding sources are open to more regular competition, and therefore some of those sort of guaranteed sources of funding that were coming into the authority are no longer there. It doesn't mean that those sources of funding aren't available to the area, because as you'll be aware that some of those sources of funding are open to competition for our district colleagues, and in recent weeks the districts have been successful in securing quite a lot of levelling up funding which will come into the county and deliver outcomes. What it does mean for us as an organisation, though, it creates more uncertainty about whether those services that we previously delivered and perhaps delivered on a strategic level are still able to be delivered in that way. Some of that relates to our skills and training agenda, and some of it also relates to access to infrastructure funding. So again, cutting across some of the sort of comments that have been made earlier, planning ahead at this moment in time becomes a little bit more difficult. You are aware, obviously, of the ongoing discussions regarding potentially moving forward to a county deal or a devolution deal. That may or may not provide some sort of further security as we go forward in that way. The other main thing I wanted to sort of touch base on was, again, something that's been raised already this morning, is across my services, the impact of inflation. We do engage closely and regularly with our suppliers to make sure that in the context of the impact of inflationary pressures, we are reacting and responding, particularly in terms of the interventions that can be put in place. We're very keen to make sure that these are seen on the basis of the wider social value of the impact on our supply chain rather than just the monetary costs. And you'll be aware that last year decisions were made during the financial year to actually increase the availability of funding for some of our medium-sized suppliers through the highways and transport area to, again, ensure that we didn't wait for a review period in the contract to actually look at the rates that we were actually paying. Again, that has wider impacts and implications for the wider economy, because dare I say, sort of medium-sized businesses that potentially could be under pressure. If those businesses went to the wall, then you've got further local unemployment pressures and such like. So we are demonstrating an awareness of the impact of those inflationary pressures on the local market. What that does, though, obviously, though, raise is whether in the context of whether that is sustainable. So the ongoing challenges, which we'll probably have to keep looking at as to whether our policies and our intervention levels are the right intervention levels. One way of summarising it is our buying power is reducing in terms of the impact of inflation, and then again tying that back with Councillor Bunny's observation, if there are more potholes and we can't buy as much sort of delivery, then that obviously has an ongoing impact. So that might be where we may have to revisit at some point whether the ways in which we intervene in that arena are at the right levels, which obviously will have further implications. In terms of other services directly impacted in that same sort of way, we've just relet the contract, or in the process of reletting the contract for our household waste recycling centres. The costs came back higher than in the previous contract, not beyond the levels that we'd expected, but again it demonstrates that in all areas of activity there is an increase of costs for the services that we're delivering. And another large area where some of the impacts of inflation are having a particular impact is in our public transport arena. So whilst we have a transformational project looking at home to school transport, which is on track and is over recovering against some of the savings, on the other hand, the wider transport arena is suffering from increased inflation due to wages, pressures in terms of the supply chain regarding the lack of driver availability, and that is then playing itself out in the context of the choices that the authority will have to make in terms of what it can support and the cost at which it supports those activities. In terms of our capital programme, again, it's been alluded to already, we are monitoring that closely to understand the impact of material rises, significant increases over the last sort of 12 months on steel prices. Aggregates do mean that those costs fluctuate. As Andrew's already referenced, there is provision being made within the capital programme to allow for that. But each of the larger projects also has significant milestones included. So, for example, the North Hike and Relief Roads project and scheme, We are not yet committed to delivering that project on the ground. Obviously, all of the intention, ambition is still to do that, but there are still milestones at which point the authority could determine that it actually was going to cost too more. You could take a review and step back, or look at perhaps delivering a different scheme if that was considered to be appropriate. One thing that is worth noting at this moment in time in terms of the DFT's commitment to that scheme, they are adamant that their contribution won't change. So any increases in costs from an inflationary point of view on those contracts would automatically or inevitably come back to the county council. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, for very interesting points that you made, particularly on the inflationary pressures that we were discussing earlier. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It was the highways things that I was relating to when I raised my earlier questions, of course, because that's where my expertise is. I take it it's not possible to, where you've got a combination financing arrangement, where it's coming from different sources and different grants, different legislative inputs. It's not possible to put inflation in those things, because I take it nobody would enter into an agreement that had, you know, determined risk associated with it. So I think, you know, the risk is always going to be held by the county council. So that's one question. The other question I've got is to do with government grants which have been targeted more and more towards their net carbon zero agenda, with some evidence of proof that, you know, that those inputs are going to be achieved. Which may be appropriate, although I have my doubts about it, in a significant urban area like London, you know, where there is opportunities to consider the sort of transport aspects and which ones do provide better carbon zero benefits. It's far more difficult to see how that can apply in a very rural county like we have in Lincolnshire, where the opportunities are a lot more remote, and there's a greater reliance on private transport to get to work, get to hospitals, and all those sorts of things. I just wondered whether the council is doing its utmost to ensure that government understands that what might be suitable as a strategy and a policy outside the Westminster Palace windows isn't necessarily appropriate in a rural county like Lincolnshire, and that they have to bear that in mind when they do go through their grants and resourcing decisions. Otherwise we will, I think, lose out in terms of those sorts of funds. Active travel can only be argued to a certain extent, I think, in Lincolnshire, and at some stage we're going to run out of those arguments, I think, to put forward to satisfy government. So that's something that does worry me in terms of the way that government, I mean, the whole net zero strategy that government's promoting worries me greatly anyway, but it worries me particularly in relation to the situation, and that their seemingly lack of understanding of the situation in a rural county like Lincolnshire.
Thank you. You may be aware recently that the Skidmore Review has been published, which I think has 129 recommendations about how the government should redress some of the perceived failings of their current strategy to deliver zero carbon. I think there are a range of things within that report that sort of chime with the sort of like concerns and, dare I say, cynicism that you've got of the ability of ourselves to receive appropriate funding, and guarantee that, yes, we do lobby effectively and appropriately through our direct links into government departments and through those collective bodies that we're part of. What I would identify, though, is we are also being successful in achieving funding pots. So there's an initiative at the moment about Levi in terms of electric vehicle infrastructure. We've been successful in getting over £1 million as a pilot project there. So even though you may feel that the goalposts are stacked against us, we are being successful in getting money to lever in to deliver things around the county. In terms of activities such as active travel, the prominence of dealing with that on our urban areas and built-up areas probably is a given in a county the size of Lincolnshire. and we have obviously invested heavily in cycling and walking plans for all of the main urban centres and strategies for each transport strategies for each of the town to try and make sure that we tailor our bids accordingly. In terms of the long distance travel around the county, yes, there is inevitability about there having to be an ongoing reliance on the private vehicle, and that is reflected in our approach within our LTP as well. In terms of your first point, yes, the very simple answer is in the context of if we want to try and factor in risks in such a way that the inflationary costs were part and parcel of the contracts, we wouldn't be entering into some of the contracts that we've actually had in place. As I say, because of the good relationship that we've got through with Balfour BT Living Places, we did make arrangements over the last sort of few months to actually have some within-year changes. But if we were starting at scratch and trying to build those in as a matter of course, then I think the sector would be unwilling or unlikely to actually enter into those contracts. On some of our capital projects, we have got different monitoring arrangements in place to actually, again, try and safeguard the interests of both us and the contractor, because at the end of the day, it's not in the contractor's interest to actually not deliver the project or deliver the scheme, because reputationally that's not a place they want to be in either.
Can I just return? Chairman, thank you. I think we need to be very careful when we talk about active travel and what we're doing in terms of active travel and transport strategies, because they do require funding in lots of cases. You know, and turning a blue line on a drawing into something meaningful for the people of Sleaford or elsewhere in Lincolnshire, it requires, you know, in some circumstances, significant investment. And it's not always obvious where that investment is going to come from, and whether it will come from government support, or from, you know, the abilities that the county council's got. I do, and indeed, active travel, I think, has some pros and cons associated with it in terms of actually moving around the urban areas and moving around what happens in Lincolnshire, which is moving from the urban areas to another urban areas, because that's where the job is. There's a bit of it, there sometimes can be contradictions in terms of actually delivering those sorts of things anyway.
Don't disagree with your observations, Councillor. I think in terms of the way we go about actually identifying projects and activities and levering in funding for them, whether that's active travel or physical road schemes as we have traditionally built, the challenge is just the same of making sure we can actually pinpoint the appropriate funding sources and get the balance right with the County Council's own contribution.
Thank you both. Lucy, you did indicate you'd like...
I was just going to just sort of try to bring the discussion around the role and remit of this committee, because obviously there are a lot of information within the combined assurance, but this role of the committee is around the assurance framework, governance and risk, and you can get into the policy and some of the that was all.
And then look at the actual impact on our decision making. Thank you.
Chairman, I should just say there was a risk associated with regeneration funding.
Just a small point, Madam Chairman. I do not see any word of the use of the word innovation in this at all. And innovation, working with partners, is somewhere where we're going to start deliver some of this.
Apologies, Councillor Skinner. It sits below, I suppose, the high-level information that's in this report, that there is a recognition that we need to work differently, work smarter, both with our contractors and with our partners. Glenn referred earlier to the sort of digital agenda. We work closely across his teams in the context of actually how the broadband infrastructure or perhaps future digital systems need to be involved. We also talk very closely about the innovation that's required in respect of actually the zero carbon agenda that Councillor Allen's referred to. We're exploring with our contractors the way in which different use of materials can actually give us more confidence about how the infrastructure repairs that we carry out are then sustained, but also at the same time actually reduce our carbon footprint, so that activity does take place and is probably predominantly reported back through the scrutiny committees in a more detailed fashion.
Indeed, but it does affect overall strategy at the end of the day, because the ability to do all those things changes the plan in the first place. So, and particularly working with partners across the piece, I think there's a lot more to be had there. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one. I did mention it last year, I think, this time, and one of your main, obviously, services there is your highways, Andy. And when you think that every single household in Lincolnshire can complain to you, every single one, that's the only directorate that really that happens in. So you do marvellously well. I don't know how you cope with all the moans and groans and complaints, anywhere from some poor lady down a little road that's not even been adopted to the MP in your left ear as well. I think you do extraordinarily well. I don't know how you do it. You've got grey hair. I do hope you sleep well at night, but you do well. I know you could do with another 20 million or whatever it is, but so I've got to congratulate you on that. I did it last year and I'm doing it this year.
You say that everybody could complain. It feels on some days like that everybody is complaining, but thank you for the comments.
Yeah, I don't think we're, you know, the bottom line, Andy, is that, you know, there's huge, as we've heard from other directors, you know, it's the inflationary cost pressures, particularly on the things that you're dealing with. It's going to be very acute for highways. When we've got some real pressures from very rural communities and urban communities about sort of what we can actually realistically deliver on some of the road maintenance, which is a huge problem, and hopefully inflation will tail off, but that doesn't always mean that the input costs will tail off. Sometimes they stay very doggedly high and don't follow the downward trend of everything else, and the government funding is unlikely to go up substantially, one supposes. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. Any further questions to Andrew? No? So if I could turn to Mark, please, and I'm sorry to keep you all this time, Mark. So if we could hear your report from Fire and Rescue. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Fire and Rescue, from the last 12 months or so, has really been guided from the back of our recent His Majesty's Inspectorate report. So that's our National Assurance Report, really, for the people of Lincolnshire, to give an overview of the level of service that is provided to the communities of Lincolnshire. Through this period, we've been working on a significant action plan to address some of the areas of where we did need to improve on last year, and that was predominantly within the area of how we delivered our protection function. Protection is how we support our business communities to ensure that the people working in those premises and actually the people who are visiting them are safe, and we give advice, support, and actually when required we have the powers to prosecute. We also had an area within our equality, diversion and inclusion agenda, which was recognised that we didn't prioritise that as much as we should have done in the past. I think the assurance that we have at the moment is both of those areas have had a significant improvement through the work that's being done, particularly within the protection area. We've had the inspectors have came into the service twice in the last 12 months to look at our progress, which has resulted in the fact that they no longer see it a cause of concern, and have been followed that up with a public letter stating that they were pleased with the progress that's been made within that area. Our work that we're doing with our staff in regards to equality, diversion and inclusion is gathering quite a lot of momentum, and that's been covered within all areas of the service through dedicated training, through ensuring we've updated policies, ensuring that we've made it a clear focus for all of our staff, not only as they're coming into the service, but also people as part of their awareness training throughout their life span within the organisation. And again, we've had some positive feedback from His Majesty's Inspectorate when they came and seen that they're really pleased with the positive progress in there. Another area where we focus on is in prevention activities. Over in the last 12 months or so, we've had a significant focus in regards to how we give advice and support across to our communities to make themselves, make people more safer in their homes. One of our main drivers within that is by delivering home fire safety visits, and that's about us going into people's homes, giving them support, giving them advice, but also fitting smoke alarms where appropriate. We had an aspirational target of increasing our visits up to 10,000 for this year. That was a deliberate aspirational target, with our thinking knowing that we wasn't really necessarily going to meet that on year one, but what it was about was trying to challenge more innovative ways on how we can identify vulnerable people, how we can create space for our crews to be able to go and visit people, and how our dedicated advocates can look at different ways how we can interact with more people. The positive impact in regards to that we are probably going to be looking at around about 7,000 home safety visits this year, which was, Barron was looking around about 4,000 plus on the previous year. It's been a good direction of travel, but we do recognise that there's more to do. To ensure that we are making the best use of our resources, we're working closely actually with Glenn's team as well to look at how we can share information to identify our most vulnerable people in our high-risk areas, and I think it's a really good example. The two directors are coming together to ensure that we actually have a true understanding of where our most vulnerable people are and how we can support each other in making them safe. Another, obviously, a critical area within fire and rescue is our response model, so that what we class everything as responders, how we actually have our resources and our people to respond to emergency events as required. Fortunately, or I say fortunately, it's been on the back of some really hard work that we've always been consistently rated as good in this area. So I think that gives a assurance level for the people of the communities that when they do dial 999, that a fire engine is going to get there timely, it's going to get there with suitably trained, competent and confident workforce with the right equipment. They have to do the role. So within the capital programme, there's been a commitment to ensure that we've got the right equipment, the best equipment and appliances to deliver on that, and that has been rolled out continually over the last few years. The area where we do have a focus on, which is our biggest challenge, is supporting our on-call staff. So our on-call are the stations that are that they respond as and when they are required to. At an incident, they have their main employments outside of fire and rescue. 29 out of our 38 stations are dedicated on-call stations, and all 38 stations have an on-call element of it. Our challenges in regards to retention of keeping our staff, and also making sure that they have a home work-life balance, because we recognise society changes, demands of society have changed, and people being able to give up the amount of free time that they used to do to be able to make themselves available to respond to their local station is more of a challenge. So we do need to be more future focused in regards to that, to recognise what are the demands of local community and society to almost change the offer of what we can give to people to make it as attractive as possible, and also to ensure that when we have got them within the service, that we can make the role as rewarding as possible, to ensure that they do want to stay with us as long as possible. One of the areas that we do recognise is a way of keeping our on-call engaged is through our co-responding activities. Co-responding is an element that we deliver on 26 of our stations, delivering essential medical response. So we've done a review in the last year to look at a more future-focused model for a co-responding, to ensure that we can maintain that capability. And we're just in the final discussions on obtaining dedicated funding for that capability. So we are hoping that within the next month or so we can confirm that, to ensure that we can keep the co-responding going for the future, which is not only, I feel, the right thing to do for the people of Lincolnshire, but also it does add a valuable retention element for our firefighters on our stations. An area that is almost a live and developing issue, which is being played out nationally, is in regards to culture within the fire and rescue services. Again, it's something that's been quite high within the media, following on the back of London Fire Brigade's cultural report. It was absolutely appropriate and right for us to hold a mirror up against ourselves to a degree, and actually have a deep dive within our own organisation to give ourselves a level of assurance that we have the right cultures and the accepted behaviours that happen within Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue. That is a continual piece of work, and we will continue doing that piece of work. So far, what we have done, we've commissioned an internal report in regards to what our culture looks like. Myself and the rest of my senior leadership team have gone out and visited all stations. We've opened up dedicated confidential reporting lines for people to have access. We've linked into specific staff network groups, particularly the Women in the Fire Service network group. I personally wrote to every single woman who works for Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue to offer support and assurance. And the position where we are at the moment, we're not feeling that we've got the levels of behaviours that have been identified within the media. I'm not saying that we haven't got pockets of behaviours that we need to address, but we will be addressing them, but we have not got the levels of the abhorrent behaviours that have been circulated within the media. So for that, I have a reasonable feeling that we have got the right staff within our organisation that are focused in regards to how they support our communities and also support each other. And then the final probably level that we are of assurance that we are focusing on, which is live at the moment, is in regards to the pay negotiations that are happening nationally. That's an area that actually there's a call going on as we speak at the moment to see what would be the next steps in regards to that. We are acutely aware that this is a national negotiation. This isn't something that we can negotiate at a local level. So we are waiting to see how that plays out through the local government association, through the National Joints Council, to see what offer may or may not be offered in the next 24 hours or so. The impact in two areas which we're absolutely focused on is one in regards to what would that mean in regards to affordability, but also if there is not an agreed pay offer, then we have our business continuity plans already in place to mitigate any industrial action that could happen within the next fortnight or so. I say that because I offer the assurance that actually we've got some good, robust business continuity plans in place. We've engaged with all members of our operational staff already to get a good understanding of the level of service that we will be able to provide if industrial action is called, recognising that it will be less than what we would normally have on a day-by-day basis, but we feel it's also at a good level that we would not be able to compromise any of our response model for the people of Lincolnshire. So I'll pause at that point if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Andrew.
Well, this meeting's characterised by good levels of assurance, and that's another one, I think. I'm pleased to not see the concern we had last year. You had a leadership gap at shift level, etc. That's not there anymore. You've addressed that. Co-responding, I was going to ask about, but that's encouraging that you're continuing with that. And I applaud your proactivity on the culture issues. One simple question, though. I know Lincolnshire is a very, very large county, but is 38 stations sustainable in the long term?
Thank you for your questions. I'll probably just pick up on a couple of your observations. Thank you for that. It was remiss of me to say, yeah, the leadership challenges that we had a while ago has been addressed. We've done a full review of a leadership team. We've changed our leadership team quite significantly through there, and we've had some really good people that we brought into the organisation that's had a fresh pair of eyes, and it has really created a positive outlook. So yeah, thank you for that observation. In regards to the question about is 38 stations enough in regards to the county, we are a very large rural county, and 38 stations in the locations where we are, if we was able to ensure that they were available 24/7 every hour of the day, then that would give us the confidence that we would be able to reach all of our high-risk areas, and pretty much, in fact, all of our areas within about a 15-minute response time, which is a good response time for a rural service. But this is where links to my area of focus, which is our on-call stations. As 29 of them are predominantly on-call, our challenge is probably less so about where the stations are, the amount of stations, but it's actually the challenge to ensure that we can keep them available at our most high-risk times. I think what we need to recognise, and to a degree being realistic, is I think the days where we can have every single one of our 38 stations on call every hour of the day is probably unrealistic, but also I think now when we understand where our risk areas are, and where our risk areas are, is where we are most likely to have fires or significant events. It probably isn't always warranted to have every single station on the run all the time. What our preference is to ensure that we have the resources in the right places at the right time to ensure that we can respond when we're going to be needed. Notwithstanding that, we're always continually working towards recruitment and retentions to get to 100% of the time on every single station, but our focus needs to be on where we need to put our resources, where our most demand is and where our high risk is, and then we can have to build on that. So I think in a short way of answering the question, I feel that 38 stations is a realistic number. I think the challenge is making sure that we can keep them available as much as we possibly can.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. I just got two questions, and they follow on from the assurance you've already given me, and I presume I'm asking you for even more assurance, or to consider different aspects of the assurance that you provided. One is the cultural one, and there have been all sorts of things that appeared in a number of the emergency services that I think, 20 years ago you wouldn't have expected to appear. It's just the nature of the way that recruitment's taken place, and society as a whole, I suppose, in terms of what's acceptable and how changes have taken place. And I'm sure every chief officer of any of the emergency services saying, I'm quite sure my officers wouldn't be like that. But unfortunately, it does seem as though the more that we delve into things, the more problems do seem to come out. So I would hope that you will continue to assess those cultural aspects within your domain, and ensure that that the county isn't going to be embarrassed by Buckinghamshire type sort of announcements or in the future. So that's one thing. So it's really a question of being assured for the assurance you've already been given, I suppose. The other thing that I think worries me, perhaps in the longer term, is the number of stations that we've got on call, and the ability of the officers it is to get to the station once a call's been made, because it strikes me that it's becoming more and more, because of various policies and strategies being promoted, it's becoming more and more difficult for people to move around. And indeed, if we are to meet carbon zero, we probably can't move around very much, or not in the way that we used to be able to do. So are you giving some consideration to how officers will ensure that they can make the on-call journeys and the on-call arrangements, so that the on-call stations can do what they need to do in providing, the response times that they need to do? Because it does strike me as it may well become more and more difficult as we get into the future, and more expensive for your officers to do it if they're forced into electric vehicles as well.
Yeah, thank you. So in regards to the cultural assurance, yeah, absolutely. I sit here as a chief officer being absolutely not going to be naive enough to say we don't have poor behaviour that's going on in the organisation, because when you're employing over 700 people, there's going to be examples. Our absolute commitment and priority is twofold. One, in regards if anybody is subjected to any poor behaviours or any bullying, harassment or misogyny that we've been, that they absolutely have the confidence, and also they have the ability to be able to raise that quickly, with confidence and without any fear or favour any negative impacts in regards to that. And my second commitment has been to my workforce is actually, if we do uncover such behaviours, then they will be dealt with swiftly, robustly and appropriately. And that message is being repeated through the organisation. But no, you're absolutely right in what you're saying. This isn't just an assurance check for the here and now. This is about actually how we want to be now and for the future. I think your observations in regards to how things may have been 20 years ago, I think it is absolutely right that I think we recognise that, because when I say we're recognising that I firmly believe behaviours were still going on 20, 30 years ago. I think the difference of the culture in society, which I see as a positive, that actually people are standing up and saying, no, this isn't acceptable and this is wrong. And actually it's down for us as leaders to be able to support people that are being subject to that. And I think that's a really strong message that we are pushing through our organisation. And ultimately coming to the conversation is, well, actually, if you don't align to our behaviours, then frankly, then we won't have you in the organisation and we will be parting company. And I think that is something that we will be adhering to. In regards to your second question, in regards to our on-call stations. So with our anybody that we employ to support an on-call station have to live within 5 minutes of the station. So we have a requirement that, so in essence, it's relatively close. So,
is that 5 minutes by car, or 5 minutes walking, or 5 minutes cycling?
So it is 5 minutes by car, but in essence, if they haven't got use of a car or whatever, it'd be down to their responsibility to ensure that they can get 5 minutes within the station. So clearly if they haven't got a car, or if they are working, or they are going about their leisure time, they still need to ensure that they get to the station within 5 minutes. To give you some assurance, we look on average across the board that we are still getting a response time around 3.5 minutes of people getting into the stations. So we do get people in a timely manner, but we are linking in regards to the environmental sustainability agenda, in regards to what does that mean in regards to the amount of traffic that's on the roads. I think where we've got most opportunity to look for the future and how we can have a better contribution to that is really in regards to our support fleet, which actually it's our support fleet vehicles that probably do more mileage around the county, and that's an area that we are looking at how we can make that more environmentally sustainable. So in regards to our operational staff actually going into the stations, I think by design, because we need a very timely response, the challenge about making sure we don't compromise that is in regards to where we recruit people from.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, it's overall, obviously you've got no red areas, and actually improving performance over the year, which is very encouraging from the audit committee's point of view. And I know what you said about your on-call firefighters is very difficult, and also retaining people to do that as well. We acknowledge that's one of your risks, and likely something that you can work on over the next year, but it will always be the case once poses. So thank you once again. Any further questions for Mark? No? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So to look, members, at the report in general, I think we've got sort of some good assessments there of the state of our organisation in terms of the assurances we can take from the RAG codings that we have in front of us. And it's all, I think, a positive message and generally positive trend, which is good. So that gives the committee some vital assurance in that respect. Obviously, there's some general themes which are cross-cutting, really, which are our recruitment and retention of qualified staff, apprenticeships, I think we've covered, and also the general inflationary pressures that all our services are facing, and the effect that has directly on the stuff, on the inputs we buy, but on our staff who run the services as well, and also just a general sense of our resilience to cope with these sort of changes, which I think we've always been as an authority quite fleet of foot in actually accepting things as they change and trying to look ahead, which is that horizon scanning, I think, which we as a committee are always trying to look to, and particularly in future we're trying to have more working jointly, if you like, with our scrutiny colleagues as well. So I think all in all that's a positive overview, and I do thank everybody for all their contributions, and I'm sure Mark would join me in reiterating that. Okay, thank you. So on that note, thank you all once again, and I'm sure we're all happy to note what you've told us during the course of the morning. So thank you very much. Thank you. And if we can then move on to our draft annual report, which we were thank you. Which I'm in the process of putting something together for Lucy for the full council meeting. Lucy, can I just turn to you? I do apologise I didn't get it to you over the weekend, Lucy, but I'm working on that, the upfront preface, if you like, from my point of view.
Thank you, Chairman. So I had a go at pulling together your draft annual report based on your work and minutes during the year. I followed the same format. It hopefully in next year it'll revert back to having the cycle of financial year. It's just been a bit of a problem waiting for some of the reports from our external auditors. So I waited as long as I could. So we hopefully pulled everything together. There's some areas in red that I highlighted in case there was anything that you wanted to draw out. But I think it sort of picks up all the assurance work that you've done, and I've tried to keep it in plain English for you, so that again, when you report to the council this week or next week, 17th, you'll hopefully get some good engagement about how the committee's made a difference to how the council's being run.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a fitting sign-off for your tenure, Lucy. It reads of an audit committee exercising its duty as the watchdog and promoting things that are good. I'm intrigued by your choice of cover pictures. That's to test our geographical knowledge, is it? I have no idea where it is, but perhaps you know where it is. I've got a correction on page 13, please, Chair. You've named Ian and myself as independent persons. Now, we're not. That's a very specialist thing. Somebody who oversees complaints against councillors, which I do in West Lindsey and Bassett Law. We are independent added members. That's the correct title. Yeah. But yeah, it reads well, Chair, and I think the audit committee is doing its work as it should.
So obviously, Lucy, I usually try to take it to the informal exec, but I think that's going to be a bit of a struggle this time, so it will just have to go to the full council, and I will present it a week on Friday, 17th, is it? Full council meeting? Yes. Yes, yeah. We okay?
I was just trying to find out when the next informal exec was, whether you could have...
It's probably after the publication.
It's after the publications.
Of the auditor's comments on the on the accounts effectively. Yeah.
That was one of the reasons, yes, and also waiting for the combined assurance. So
Yeah.
normally you would have had this annual report is produced in October,
Yeah, and then I present it to
and then you can take it to the
December.
December
Yep,
council meeting, and you
Yep,
have that running.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So we're all happy with that. I haven't got it up on the screen earlier on. Okay. We have a show of hands, please, if all in approval. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Are we okay? That one? If we could, I do apologise. I was going to be a bit worried about that. If we can just then move on to the item 6, which is the work programme. And have any comments from members there too? Just as while you scrutinise that, Mark and I did have a online Teams meeting with the chairman of Overview and Scrutiny Management Board, and we're going to set up sort of some strategy regarding joint working regarding that. Obviously, it's been an ongoing process, and I'm going to attend the 23rd meeting of the 23rd of the OSPM and sort of get some feedback from the committee there. And also I did attend, and I don't think I mentioned this, that was after the last meeting we had, I think, I did attend East Midlands Audit Forum at Leicester, which was quite interesting, particularly, and this is looking ahead to a training, particularly in view of the comments that were, and the examples that were giving about some councils that got into serious difficulties regarding some of their practices, financial and otherwise, which were quite alarming. And but I think we're going to address that in one of our training sessions in the forthcoming months. And these were sort of aside from Northampton, the Croydon and several actually other authorities, which is very interesting. And then with Mazars, I took part in a panel to look at sort of audit issues. But again, that was a management Microsoft Teams meeting at the beginning of December, which was very interesting as well. So, do we have any comments on the work programme?
Please, Jim. Lucy, you're down as a contributor for the next audit committee. Is that right?
Yes, it will be my last one.
It will be your last.
Yes.
That will be your last one.
It will indeed.
Right. I shall save my comments until then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Might be running it close, but it's not till the 31st. So, on that note, do we all approve the work programme? Members, if you could indicate accordingly for Tom. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that concludes our meeting, everyone. Thank you for everyone for attending. And
Chair, you just told us that you're keeping up to date by liaising with other authorities. Does that report reflect that networking, Lucy? Oh,
it
right.
does, yeah. The East Midlands Audit Forum, Andrew, is quite a new thing. It's probably been going for about last year, and we had an in-person meeting. The chair lady is, if I'd say the chair lady these days, the chairman is a Leicester City councillor, and we had very interesting, some districts, no other counties, but some districts, and very interesting to see people's experiences, particularly of audit committees. Some very different from us in terms of what they do and sort of where they are in the process. I think we can take heart from the fact. I think we are leaders in that regard, I would say.
I think this meeting is the best of the year.
It is, I think so, yes. Yeah. And I know we get a little bit off piece sometimes for Lucy, but I think so thank you once again, everyone. Thank you.